The winter wind whipped through the narrow streets of Boston, scattering powdered snow across the cobblestones and rattling the tall, frost-laden windows of the old brick townhouses. Inside one of the grandest of these buildings, Nathaniel Hawthorne stood alone in his private study, the room bathed in the warm, flickering glow of candlelight. The fire in the hearth crackled intermittently, sending sparks dancing into the shadows, and the walls, lined with shelves of meticulously bound ledgers and forgotten manuscripts, seemed to close around him, pressing the silence into every corner. He held a stack of letters in his gloved hand, their envelopes worn, ink-faded, each one a futile attempt at connection he had long since deemed unworthy. His voice, low and taut with restrained emotion, broke the silence. All of this, and still nothing worth keeping. The words fell softly into the air, unacknowledged, yet they carried a weight heavier than the winter dusk pressing against the windows. With a precise, deliberate motion, he dropped the letters into the fire, their edges curling, blackening, and then disappearing into smoke that coiled upward, twisting toward the high ceiling. The scent of burnt paper lingered faintly, sharp and acrid, a reminder of rejection rendered ritualistic. He paused mid-motion, his fingers lingering over one letter that remained untouched, its creamy envelope catching the soft candlelight. For a fleeting heartbeat, his hand trembled slightly, betraying the faintest ripple of curiosity before he shook it off, retreating into the cold control of habit. Outside, the snowfall thickened, the muffled sound of flakes landing on the street below filling the brief silence between crackling fire and his measured breath. Nathaniel moved toward the window, the frosted panes blurring the city beyond, and traced a finger along the cold glass, watching the street lamps cast pools of golden light over the white canvas of winter. Each shadow seemed alive, shifting with the rhythm of his thoughts, and the flickering reflection of candlelight in his silver eyes mirrored an inner turbulence he did not allow himself to name. He lifted the final letter, hesitated, and stared at the delicate script as if it held a secret meant only for him. A faint tightening in his chest drew his attention inward, a knot of anticipation he had long suppressed. His gloved hand, hovering over the flames, trembled imperceptibly, the shadows of the room stretching across his face like dark ink pooling in corners. The fire crackled again, louder this time, and a spark leapt from the hearth, catching briefly on the edge of the letter, illuminating the curl of the envelope in sudden golden light. Nathaniel's breath caught, the movement slow, measured, deliberate. His body, usually so rigid with authority and control, leaned slightly forward, a microgesture of engagement with something unknown, something that had pierced the calculated barriers of his mind. He allowed himself a single, lingering look at the letter, the flickering flame reflecting across the silver in his eyes and across the room lined with dark wood and cold books, capturing the solitary grandeur of the moment, the quiet suspense of discovery, and the faint, unspoken question that hovered between curiosity and restraint. The snow outside continued to fall, soft and relentless, blanketing the streets below in silence, and Nathaniel, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, felt the brush of anticipation, the quiet pull of something he could not yet name, holding him suspended on the edge of a choice he had not expected to face. Julia Carter leaned over the oak desk in her museum office, the soft morning light filtering through tall windows dusted with frost. She traced her fingers along the spines of old archival letters, the texture of the parchment warm beneath her touch, each one a fragment of a lifelong past, whispering stories that had never been spoken aloud. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "Some words deserve to be read, maybe by the right person." Her voice carried a quiet reverence, almost as if the letters themselves might respond. Outside, the streets of Boston were cloaked in a pale winter haze, the muffled clatter of distant snowplows and the faint crunch of boots on icy sidewalks blending with the rhythmic creak of the buildings settling in the cold. The museum was unusually still, the faint scent of old paper and polished wood mingling with the crisp winter air that seeped through tiny gaps in the window frames. Julia carefully arranged a portfolio of letters she had been cataloging, stacking them with meticulous care, her mind momentarily wandering to the people who had written them, imagining the lives behind the careful loops of ink. One envelope, cream-colored with delicate handwriting, caught her eye, its contents a note she had written recently for a gallery submission, heartfelt and unguarded, a reflection of thoughts she had not meant to show anyone outside the archives. She adjusted her scarf and tucked the letter into the portfolio, unaware that it would soon find its way into the hands of someone whose life was as insulated and meticulously ordered as her own, yet far more dangerous and commanding. As she reached for a small coffee cup, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals, her assistant knocked lightly on the door frame. "Julia, the gallery package was picked up early by the courier," he said, his tone polite but carrying a hint of urgency. She nodded, brushing a strand of copper hair behind her ear, a pang of curiosity twisting in her chest. The courier, a young man bundled in a thick coat, had been hurried, leaving the package almost carelessly on the gallery receptionist's desk. As she watched the clock, her gaze lingered on the swirling winter light outside. The snow muted, the world flattened into soft shades of gray and white. She imagined the path of the package as it moved through the city, the bustling streets and silent alleyways it had traveled, and she felt an unexpected tension, a shiver of anticipation that had nothing to do with the cold. Her mind turned briefly to Nathaniel Hawthorne, the gallery's benefactor, a man known for his meticulous control, his rare and exacting taste, and a reputation that made many pause at the thought of crossing his threshold. She had never met him personally, but the possibility of her letter reaching him stirred something intangible, a mix of apprehension and curiosity that pressed at her chest. In the quiet of the office, she set the portfolio down, smoothing the edges as if calming herself, her heart quickening with a subtle rhythm that seemed to echo the distant hum of the city beyond the frost-streaked glass. Every small movement, the scrape of paper, the tilt of her head as she examined a seal, the gentle tap of her pen against the wooden surface, became amplified in the stillness, carrying weight far beyond the mundane tasks of cataloging. Outside, the snow continued its silent descent, layering the streets in reflective light, the kind that caught in shop windows and made the world feel suspended, caught between the known and the unknown. Julia's thoughts drifted to the unseen hand that might open her letter, the careful eyes that might trace her words, and a small, unspoken hope formed that her honesty, her quiet vulnerability, might matter to someone who had the power to alter the course of a life far larger than her own. She lingered by the window a moment longer, watching the light shift across the snow and the cityscape, feeling the weight of anticipation press gently against her ribs, a silent question hanging in the air. Who would read her words, and what would it awaken in the one who did? The morning mist clung to the streets of Boston like a thin veil, softening the sharp edges of lampposts and cobblestones, while distant church bells tolled in the cold, quiet air. Julia Carter adjusted the strap of her satchel as she stepped onto the polished marble steps of the Winter Harbor Gallery, the gentle crunch of frost under her boots echoing softly. Inside, the grand space was alive with muted chatter, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers above, and the subtle glint of morning sunlight catching the frost-coated windows. She scanned the room instinctively, cataloging the guests and their subtle postures, the delicate hand gestures of patrons discussing recent acquisitions, and the way the gallery attendants moved with precise, silent grace. She had barely set down her portfolio when a familiar hush swept over the central exhibition hall. The massive doors at the far end opened with a controlled weight, and Nathaniel Hawthorne entered, his presence folding the space around him into an invisible perimeter of authority. Guests instinctively straightened, voices lowering, the subtle hum of conversation halting as if the room itself recognized his command. Julia froze mid-step, her chest tightening as her eyes caught his silhouette framed by the frost-laced windows behind him, his dark coat absorbing the soft light, the silver in his eyes sharp against the deep shadows of his face. She could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken tension that threaded through the room, drawing her gaze like a magnet while demanding she remain aware of every small movement. Nathaniel's steps were measured, deliberate, each echo against the marble floor a signal of his calculated control. He did not scan the crowd, yet his eyes found her almost immediately, catching the edge of the envelope she had tucked in her portfolio, the single line of her handwriting that had traveled unknown through the city. Julia's fingers brushed nervously over the strap of her satchel, her heart stuttering as the recognition settled between them without a word spoken. The gallery assistant, unaware of the silent gravity, gestured toward the display and whispered something about the next presentation, but Julia hardly heard him. All awareness focused on the space between herself and Nathaniel, the invisible thread of curiosity stretching taut. As he moved closer, the crowd parted instinctively, a human river bending around the force of his presence, and Julia's steps slowed, uncertainty balancing against a fascination she could not name. She adjusted her posture, straightening her shoulders, careful to make herself neither too small nor too conspicuous, aware that every gesture might be read, every hesitation noted. The chandeliers flickered slightly, and the sunlight caught the edges of her portfolio, illuminating the envelope for just a heartbeat as if signaling a secret only he could see. Nathaniel's gaze did not waver, silver eyes narrowing slightly in thought, the smallest crease of curiosity marking his otherwise stoic expression. He paused mid-stride, hand hovering near the small stack of documents at the front desk, not reaching, merely observing, the weight of intent pressing in the space between them. Julia swallowed against the sudden dryness in her throat, the quiet of the gallery swelling around her as she felt the tension coil like a living thing, unbroken by the minor movements of others. The room, the winter light, the reflective marble, and the faint scent of polished wood and ink seemed to amplify the suspension, leaving her poised on the edge of revelation, her pulse echoing the silent anticipation. As Nathaniel continued his measured advance, the distance between them shortened, neither speaking, both aware that the next moment might tilt the fragile balance of curiosity and caution. The faint scrape of her shoes against the floor, the soft rustle of papers in her portfolio, and the muted footsteps of patrons became amplified, each sound a punctuation in the invisible conversation between them. For a moment time seemed to constrict, the gallery a suspended space where expectation hung thick, and Julia's eyes met his in a fraction of a second, enough to send a ripple of unspoken questions through the air. The envelope, the handwriting, the subtle recognition, and the quiet gravity of his presence left the moment unresolved, a taut silence that beckoned forward, pulling the viewer into the unknown tension that would define the next encounter. The gallery was quieter now, the initial stir of arrival settling into a delicate hush that seemed to draw the space inward, folding the polished marble floors and high ceilings into a pocket of suspended time. Nathaniel stood near the far wall, fingers brushing the edge of a console where the discarded envelopes had been momentarily stacked. His gaze lingered on the cream-colored envelope, the elegant curl of Julia's handwriting etched into his memory before his eyes even traced it again. "Why does her hand feel different, genuine?" he murmured, barely audible over the soft shuffle of staff rearranging canvases and the low murmur of distant conversation. He did not move it, did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he allowed the question to echo silently in the room, pressing against the spaces between the pillars and chandeliers, touching every corner with a subtle weight of anticipation. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall gallery windows, catching flecks of frost still clinging to the glass and scattering light in pale beams across his dark coat, casting long tentative shadows that stretched toward the center of the hall. Julia, unaware of his scrutiny, adjusted her portfolio with careful movements, smoothing the edges and straightening the papers inside, her hands lingering on the envelope as if drawn by instinct. Nathaniel's posture shifted imperceptibly, his back straightening, a micro-expression tightening his jaw, silver eyes narrowing in concentration, the smallest crease of curiosity marking a face usually composed of unyielding control. A gallery assistant passed nearby, whispering directions about the next presentation, but the sound was absorbed into the muted hum of the room. It did not reach Nathaniel or disturb the suspended tension that had enveloped him. He inhaled slowly, the air tasting faintly of polished wood and ink, a scent that carried him back to long-forgotten moments of anticipation, of gestures and letters burned and ignored, memories now tinted with a strange longing. His hand hovered over the envelope for a heartbeat longer, the flickering candlelight reflecting off his silver eyes and the fine lines of his gloves, tracing the shape of the letters without touching them. Julia glanced up briefly, catching the light off his profile, and a flicker of recognition passed through her expression before she diverted her gaze back to her portfolio, unaware of the weight of his focus. Nathaniel allowed himself a subtle lean toward the desk, an almost imperceptible movement, one that brought him closer to the envelope without committing to grasping it, a quiet negotiation of curiosity and restraint. The chandeliers above cast a soft glow, mingling with the winter sunlight, painting the space in muted gold and shadow, each flicker amplifying the silent conversation that passed between him and the unseen author of the letter. For a moment time seemed to slow, each second elongated as he traced the imagined trajectory of her hand across the paper, each imagined stroke a revelation he was unaccustomed to witnessing. Julia shifted her weight, adjusting the portfolio again, and the soft scrape of her shoes on marble carried through the stillness like a subtle punctuation mark, a reminder of the delicate proximity that had been imposed by circumstance. Nathaniel's eyes followed the faint movement, registering the unconscious precision in her gestures, the quiet dignity of her posture, and a sensation he had long resisted began to take root, a cautious intrigue entwined with the restraint he demanded of himself. He did not speak, he did not reach, but the tension hung taut in the space between them, a fragile wire strung across the gallery, quivering with unspoken questions and possibilities. Outside, the pale winter light deepened, shadows stretching longer across the frost-kissed streets, and the silence inside the gallery held them suspended, caught between recognition and hesitation, curiosity and guarded restraint, the quiet anticipation of the next moment pressing on both of them as if the room itself were waiting for something neither yet dared to name. The soft hum of conversation in the gallery had shifted, threading around Julia and Nathaniel with the weight of unspoken observation. The morning light had deepened into a muted, silvery glow that filtered through frost-kissed windows, casting long shifting shadows across the polished marble floors and the displays of artwork. Julia leaned over a sculptural piece, adjusting a small detail in the exhibit, her fingers brushing against the cold metal frame. She whispered gently to the attending assistant, "It is all right, we can fix this," her voice calm, deliberate, and layered with quiet confidence, a balm against the tense scrutiny of the patrons circling nearby. Nathaniel, standing several feet away, observed the scene with silent intensity, his posture composed yet taut, each line of his dark coat and the glint of silver in his eyes a statement of restrained authority. As Julia guided the assistant, redirecting the attention of a hesitant patron and diffusing a potential minor mishap with the elegance of her movements, Nathaniel's gaze followed her fluid motion, the corners of his mouth imperceptibly softening in acknowledgement of her poise. The crowd seemed oblivious to the subtle interplay, caught up in discussions of canvases and sculptures, while the space between them carried a different current, a quiet gravity that pulled at the air itself. Nathaniel stepped forward, moving with careful deliberation, the soles of his shoes whispering against the marble, and in a gesture unnoticed by the room, he positioned himself subtly between Julia and a patron who had approached too closely, the motion protective without overt interference. Julia, sensing the slight shift in the atmosphere, glanced up briefly, catching the faint movement of his hand at the small of her back as he guided her to a safer vantage near a tall window. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and she felt the invisible weight of his attention settle around her, a mixture of guarded caution and emerging admiration. The pale winter light accentuated the delicate features of her face and the poised strength in her posture, and Nathaniel's expression softened further, the harsh lines of control momentarily easing as he allowed himself the quiet observation of her competence and grace. The gallery walls, reflecting the soft light, seemed to contract the space around them, heightening the subtle tension, the unspoken connection threaded through their proximity, the faint brush of his gloved hand along her back lingering like a shadow in the corner of her perception. Julia exhaled softly, unconsciously leaning slightly into the reassurance of his presence, her awareness of the protective barrier he had formed around her mingling with a tentative curiosity about the man behind the silver eyes. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees lining the quiet city streets, scattering loose snowflakes across the sidewalks, the muffled world beyond the windows emphasizing the stillness and intensity of the interior. Nathaniel remained poised, vigilant, and yet for a brief moment, a subtle admiration threaded through his careful demeanor, a recognition of her capability and her understated courage in the face of pressure. The gallery seemed to hold its breath along with them, the space filled with suspended anticipation, shadows lengthening across the floors, the glint of frost and glass catching in the periphery of sight. Their shared awareness lingered unspoken, each movement weighted with intent, every adjustment of the portfolio, every step taken along the marble, carrying layered meaning. The quiet protective gestures, the subtle acknowledgement of skill and grace, and the unspoken admiration had created a fragile current between them, a tension both palpable and unresolved, drawing them toward a connection that neither fully understood nor yet dared to articulate. And as Julia returned to the careful alignment of the exhibit, her eyes flickering once toward the tall figure across the room, the suspended weight of observation and tentative trust pressed on the edges of the moment, leaving both of them poised on the brink of something that would demand attention, anticipation, and the inevitable continuation of their intertwined paths. The soft glow of the gallery lights had deepened into a warm, amber haze as afternoon shadows stretched across the marble floors, tracing long, deliberate lines toward the central exhibition. Julia adjusted the corner of a large canvas, her fingers lingering on the textured surface, guiding the assistant's careful movements as they repositioned a sculpture for optimal viewing. Her voice, measured and gentle, cut through the quiet hum of patrons moving along the exhibits. "Stay close. Do not speak to them yet," Nathaniel murmured from behind, his silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the air between them thrum subtly. The instruction was delivered without haste, a quiet command laced with concern, yet restrained, not for display but for effect, a protective gravity that left no room for argument yet demanded acknowledgement. Julia's breath caught slightly, the warmth of his shadow near her back more felt than seen, a protective force that contrasted sharply with the distant murmur of the other guests, oblivious to the silent exchange unfolding. The ambient lighting flickered against the polished marble, tracing shadows along Nathaniel's strong, unyielding frame, and Julia felt the tiny shift of his body, angled to block the patron's path, a silent assurance that she was being watched over. The subtle scent of winter air, mingling with the faint aroma of wood polish and the soft musk of the gallery space, seemed to thicken, heightening the tension between their proximity, each movement carrying amplified weight in the stillness. Julia shifted, adjusting the portfolio at her side, sensing rather than seeing the nuanced calculation in his stance, the way his shoulders were squared, and the slight lean forward as if to absorb any potential misstep before it reached her. The brush of his presence was a quiet force, disciplined, dangerous, and careful, conveying concern without a single word louder than necessary. Nathaniel's eyes tracked her movements with a meticulous calm, noting the gentle curve of her hands over the portfolio, the steadying breath she took, the subtle incline of her head toward a display that had captured the attention of another guest. For a moment the gallery felt suspended, a delicate equilibrium between observation and interaction, safety and exposure, the protective tension threading the space between them. Julia glanced toward the far windows, frost etching delicate patterns against the glass, winter light shifting with the fading day, and the outside world seemed muted, a pale backdrop to the charged, silent choreography of presence and distance within the gallery. Nathaniel did not speak, did not shift beyond his precise positioning, yet the sheer weight of his vigilance resonated against her back, a tangible warmth in contrast to the cool marble beneath her shoes. The patron's movements and murmurs became background noise, absorbed into the layered tension, while every small gesture between Julia and Nathaniel held significance, a complex language of proximity, restraint, and cautious reliance. And as a faint shadow of the approaching evening crept across the room, highlighting the subtle gleam of frost on the distant windows, both remained poised on the edge of awareness, suspended in the intricate balance between guarded attention and the first hints of trust, a fragile anticipation threading through the air, unspoken yet unmistakable, leaving the moment unresolved, tension coiled and ready to snap into the next inevitable encounter. The light in the gallery had softened into a deep, golden haze as late afternoon edged toward dusk, filtering through frost-streaked windows and casting long, delicate shadows across the polished marble floors. Nathaniel Hawthorne moved to the private study adjacent to the main hall, the envelope that had captured his attention earlier lying untouched on the console, its cream surface catching the fading sunlight. He lifted it finally, hands steady but tension taut in his shoulders, and exhaled slowly, as if holding his breath had been a conscious act for the past hours. "You see me," he murmured, voice low, carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room like the soft patter of snow against window panes outside. The words were not meant for her, yet they trembled with the acknowledgement of a vulnerability he had long hidden, an admission to himself as much as to the ghost of her presence that lingered in his mind. As he carefully opened the envelope, the delicate rustle of paper seemed amplified in the still, muted space, each movement deliberate, reverent, like the unfolding of a ritual long denied. The letter inside revealed a depth of honesty and empathy, simple yet piercing, and Nathaniel's eyes traced each line with a subtle intensity that belied the stoic mask he wore for the world. Memories of past gestures, discarded notes, and burned confidences flickered through his mind, each one a shadow against the clarity of this singular communication. Outside, the city had softened under a pale winter light, the streets dusted in frost, and the distant sounds of car engines and footsteps became background to the silence of the study, emphasizing the magnitude of his focus. Julia's reflection caught faintly in the polished surface of the desk as he leaned over the letter, her presence imagined, almost tangible, and he felt the strange, tentative warmth of connection coil quietly in his chest. A single gloved finger hovered near the paper, pausing before tracing a line of her handwriting, absorbing the cadence of her pen strokes without breaking the fragile tension of the moment. The shadows from the nearby candles flickered across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the softening in his eyes, a contrast that spoke of inner recognition, longing, and restraint all at once. He remained still for what felt like an eternity, body coiled, posture rigid yet suspended, breathing measured as if the slightest movement might shatter the fragile revelation that had settled between him and the unseen writer. The gallery beyond the study seemed to fade, light and sound receding into soft obscurity, leaving only the golden envelope, his focused gaze, and the weight of anticipation hanging like a suspended note between heartbeats. Nathaniel's hand finally brushed the envelope, a tentative touch that conveyed acknowledgement without possessiveness, the first small act of acceptance, and in that brief movement, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the tension that had governed his interactions throughout the day. The golden light from the window glimmered across the surface, illuminating the delicate folds and creases, and for a single heartbeat, Nathaniel allowed himself to imagine her near, adjusting a stray lock of hair, unaware of the transformative effect her words had wrought. Time seemed to hold in the suspended glow, each second stretching with the weight of unspoken emotion, the study thick with quiet anticipation, and Nathaniel remained poised at the edge of understanding, the fragile revelation of the letter leaving him suspended, drawn into a moment of emotional breakthrough yet unresolved, curiosity and longing lingering in the warm shadows as he turned his gaze slowly toward the distant gallery, knowing that the next encounter with her would demand navigation, of feelings he had long kept controlled, the space between revelation and interaction charged with cinematic tension, anticipation, and the weight of a vulnerability he was only beginning to acknowledge. The late afternoon light had softened into a muted gold that spilled across the gallery floor, catching on polished marble and brushed metal display frames. Nathaniel Hawthorne stood alone near a corner alcove, the envelope he had been fixated on all day now open in his hands. His breath was steady but measured, each exhale carrying the weight of a long-suppressed realization. "You see me," he murmured, the words slipping out with a quiet reverence, unshared yet profoundly intimate, a bridge between the isolation he had maintained and the vulnerability the letter had invoked. The handwriting was unmistakable, Julia's precise, unguarded script revealing layers of empathy and thoughtfulness he had not allowed himself to consider in years. The air in the gallery seemed to thicken, warm with the faint scent of polished wood and the lingering traces of winter outside, as if the room itself had leaned in to witness the silent exchange between him and the words on the paper. His eyes traced each line slowly, absorbing the cadence and intent, the gentle insistence of honesty beneath the elegant loops of ink. Nathaniel's posture, normally so taut and controlled, shifted imperceptibly, shoulders loosening, fingers curling around the envelope with a reverence that bordered on awe. Outside, the winter light dimmed gradually, casting long soft shadows that moved with the waning sun, while inside, the gallery seemed to suspend the hours, freezing in the quiet gravity of the moment. Nathaniel allowed himself to imagine Julia standing somewhere just beyond his sight, adjusting a stray lock of hair, unaware of the effect her words had wrought, the imagined warmth of her presence mirrored in the subtle pulse of his chest. The envelope felt heavier, almost alive in his hands, carrying more than paper and ink. It held a conduit to something he had thought irretrievable: trust, connection, and the first tremors of vulnerability. He did not speak, did not shift beyond the careful angle of his body over the letter, yet every microgesture spoke volumes. The way his gaze lingered, the slight crease of his brow, the subtle exhale through his nose as if testing the reality of what he was allowing himself to feel. A flicker of candlelight caught on the envelope's surface, illuminating the folds and creases, and Nathaniel's hand brushed the paper tentatively, not possessing but acknowledging, absorbing its presence and the truth it contained. For a fleeting moment, time stretched, each second magnified in the stillness of the gallery, the hush of patrons and distant footsteps outside fading into insignificance compared to the tension and recognition that had settled within him. Shadows lengthened across the marble, tracing delicate patterns on the floor, mirroring the intricate threading of his emotions, a tapestry of curiosity, longing, and restrained admiration. Nathaniel's eyes shifted toward the gallery's main hall, imagining her movement there, the faint curve of her shoulders, the careful grace of her hands, and a rare warmth sparked within his chest, tempered by restraint and the cautious acknowledgement of her impact. Every heartbeat became audible in its subtle intensity, a rhythm marking the gravity of realization, while his posture remained poised between anticipation and measured control. He allowed himself a single lingering look at the envelope, then glanced toward the distant windows, the snow outside catching the soft, fading light, each flake reflecting a fragment of the unspoken tension between them. The moment held suspended, fragile yet charged, and Nathaniel remained on the precipice of reaching out, of moving beyond the silent recognition the letter had wrought, leaving the gallery imbued with a sense of quiet anticipation, unresolved vulnerability, and the cinematic pull of the next inevitable encounter with Julia, whose presence he could feel though not yet see. The emotional breakthrough balanced delicately with hesitation, curiosity, and the weight of unspoken longing. The gallery's evening glow had shifted to a soft, dusky amber as twilight crept along the frost-lined windows, the city beyond quieting under the hush of falling snow. Julia adjusted the strap of her portfolio, pausing near the central display, her fingers brushing lightly over the textured surface of a sculpture, while the ambient light caught the metallic highlights in a way that made the artwork shimmer subtly. Nathaniel moved beside her, deliberate and controlled, his presence close yet measured, the warmth of his coat a quiet contrast against the cool marble beneath their feet. "You are different. I need you to understand that," he said softly, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of intent but restrained by years of disciplined restraint. Julia's gaze flicked toward him, hesitation and uncertainty mingling with the faintest glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. A delicate pause stretched between them, the gallery filled with the subtle creak of polished floors and the distant shuffle of departing guests, emphasizing the silence that had grown dense around them. Her fingers brushed against the corner of the portfolio as if anchoring herself, the simple motion betraying a flutter of awareness at the nearness of him, his controlled attention threading through the space between them like an invisible tether. Outside, snowflakes drifted against the tall windows, catching the fading light and scattering it into soft patterns across the marble, while inside, the warm glow of chandeliers traced shifting shadows along Nathaniel's angular frame. He allowed himself a step closer, careful and deliberate, the angle of his body suggesting protection without intrusion, a silent offer that carried both restraint and intent. Julia's eyes widened imperceptibly, her lips parting as if to speak, yet no words emerged. Instead, she felt the subtle pressure of his presence, a tethering of the space between curiosity and confession, and a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the tension threading through their interaction. The faint scent of winter and polished wood mingled with the warmth radiating from Nathaniel's coat, grounding the charged, delicate intimacy that had formed without a single overt gesture. Each small movement, the tilt of her head, the shift of her weight, the soft brush of her sleeve against the edge of the portfolio, carried amplified meaning, mirrored in Nathaniel's posture, the quiet tightening of his jaw, and the unspoken contemplation in the silver of his eyes. He did not speak further, letting the charged silence hang like a suspended note between them, a fragile equilibrium that suggested both trust and hesitation. Julia exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, sensing the unspoken protection woven into the careful space he maintained. While her heart thudded in tandem with the invisible rhythm of anticipation, he seemed to impose around them. The shadows lengthened as the last of the daylight faded, the winter light deepening into a muted, reflective glow across the gallery walls, and Nathaniel's gaze lingered, tracing the line of her profile as if memorizing it, weighing the restraint of proximity against the pull of vulnerability and acknowledgement. Neither moved, the world around them muted and suspended, each aware of the tension coiled delicately between intent and restraint, curiosity and revelation. In that quiet interlude, their proximity, the subtle brush of intent, and the shared awareness of unspoken truths created a suspended moment of emotional hesitation, a cinematic pause pregnant with possibility, leaving both poised on the edge of confession and the uncertainty of what the next encounter would demand from their fragile, emerging connection. The ceremonial hall of the Winter Haven Palace was bathed in soft candlelight, The tall windows draped in velvet shadows while pale snow fell silently outside, painting the world in muted silver. Julia Carter stood at the center of the raised dais, the ancient bond words trembling on her lips as she spoke them aloud, the cadence of the ritual echoing against the vaulted ceilings. By my will and my heart, I offer this bond freely with clarity and trust. The words, heavy with intent and honesty, carried through the hall, drawing the gaze of every member of the royal council and the gathered nobles who lined the marble balconies. Nathaniel Hawthorne remained across from her, his posture rigid yet restrained, silver eyes softened by the uncharacteristic warmth that now illuminated his guarded expression. The air between them seemed to hum with electricity, the gravity of their shared history, the letters and the stolen moments of proximity now converging into this singular sacred instant. As Julia's voice wavered, Nathaniel took a deliberate step forward, kneeling slowly on one knee before the dais, his gloved hand rising to hers with ceremonial precision, capturing her fingers with quiet intensity. "Then I stand with you," he said, his voice low, calm, yet imbued with an authority and protectiveness that silenced the hall, reverberating as a declaration to all present. This bond was recognized, sacred and unbroken. The courtiers and council members observed in awe, the hush of reverence settling over the assembly as he completed the gesture, the silver of his eyes glinting in the candlelight, reflecting both restraint and the depth of his devotion. The sacred bond ceremony proceeded with fluid motion, each gesture purposeful, the subtle exchange of glances and hand placement conveying more than words ever could. Nathaniel extended his free hand to brush her cheek lightly, a gentle affirmation of trust, and Julia responded with a measured nod, her gaze steady and confident, a clear choice made from her own heart rather than the dictates of fate. The soft crackle of the ceremonial candles punctuated the ritual, while the marble floors glimmered under the flickering light, echoing the silent heartbeat of the hall, connecting them through touch, intent, and recognition. He then rose, keeping his hand intertwined with hers, lifting it slightly as a symbolic proclamation, his voice carrying above the subdued murmurs, "You are mine to honor, to protect, to recognize before all. Let this bond be witness to truth." Julia's chest rose and fell with deliberate calm, her choice affirmed, her vulnerability met with the cinematic restraint of Nathaniel's devotion. The royal council bowed subtly, acknowledging the finality of the union, the air thick with awe and approval, while courtiers whispered in hushed tones, the weight of legitimacy settling into the collective consciousness of the kingdom. Outside, the snow glistened against the tall windows, the cold air framing the warmth and intimacy within the hall. Nathaniel and Julia's foreheads met lightly in a quiet, cinematic intimacy, a tether of connection and mutual recognition bridging the space between formality and emotional surrender. Their hands remained clasped, a gentle squeeze affirming the choices they had made, the trust established, and the destiny now intertwined. As the final chants of the ceremony resonated through the vaulted ceilings, a soft golden glow seemed to settle around them, the hall, and the city beyond, sealing their bond with a sense of permanence. In that suspended moment, the audience could almost hear the silent acknowledgement of fate met with choice, the cinematic resolution of longing, trust, and shared destiny, the bond between Alpha King and Omega fully realized, sacred and unbreakable, leaving the hall aglow with the quiet, enduring magic of a love recognized and celebrated before the world.